Hello, my loves. Hello, hello, hello. My name is Dustina. This is Spiritual Boujee Astrology, and we're going to take a deeper look at what we can expect with the upcoming Mars retrograde in Leo and Cancer. Yes, because that is where it's going to be happening. So, on the day that I'm recording this, it is December 6th. Sorry, guys. I have been super busy over the last few days. I did not get the chance to sit down and do this sooner. And I'll be honest, like with the Mercury Kazemi that happened last night going into today, like I got a lot of rest because it like knocked me out completely. I'm not even joking. I slept for 12 hours. But two, like the mental energy that came through afterwards was like very, very clear about a lot of things. And I put a bunch of stuff down in writing just so that way I could cover it with you guys today to again, prepare everyone for what types of themes that we can expect with this two-part Mars retrograde. And I want to be clear, it is two parts. One part is the Leo aspect. We only have Mars retrograde in Leo for a month. And if you've listened to me for a while, one of the things I started to say at the beginning of November is that there will be some things that we're going to start to roll out that one side, one dynamic is probably not going to agree with. And as we go through the Mars retrograde timeline in Leo, there's going to be different splits whenever it comes to certain power dynamics. There will be some people that do not agree with other people's ideas, their positions in power, the dynamics of what has been unfolding. And there will be big separations during Mars's retrograde in Leo. But again, it's in two parts. The first part, again, Mars in Leo, it's December 6th to January 6th. The other 2/3 of the Mars retrograde is going to be in Cancer, and that goes from January 6th to February 23rd. So, as a whole, the entire retrograde is December 6th to February 23rd. And you guys know me. If I was to compare this episode to like a Mercury retrograde video, y'all know what I do. I go from the pre shadow all the way to the point of retrograde, all through the retrograde, and all through the post shadow. The problem I have with doing that with the Mars retrograde dynamic is that's going to be 6 months worth of dates, and people are going to get some things confused and blurred. And I don't want to do that because, again, this is a two-part retrogrades, and I anticipate two different situations, two different dynamics, two different attitude adjustments, course corrections in regards to this obstacle course energy that we're in. Mars in Leo is going to be one dynamic. Mars in Cancer is going to be something that is completely different. And one of the things that I went back and did, and I will cover in this episode, I'm not going to go straight into it right now, is I went and looked for previous historic events that have been done during a Mars retrograde. And I have one in particular I'm going to cover again here in just a minute. But I also want to bring up a previous timeline that for some of us has been in our lifetimes where we've actually had a retrograde in this area. Now, this is going to be for a little bit of the older generation. So, Gen Xers, guess what? It's on you. The last time we had a Mars retrograde in this area of the sky was between December of 1977 and March of 1978. If you have someone in your life that was born late 77 to early 78, this particular Mars retrograde for a lot of them is their Mars retrograde return. That's a mouthful, but it's the truth. So what does that mean? Whenever Mars goes over the natal placement, it's kind of like a birthday. When your sun comes back over the placement of the natal placement, we go, happy birthday, everybody, because it's our quote, quote, solar return. But anytime a planet comes back around and goes back over a natal placement, it is that planetary return. Many of us know what a Saturn return is. Some of us even go as far out in life as having our Uranus return. None of us will ever experience a Neptune or Pluto return unless we're vampires, and that's a different conversation. But most people have experienced Jupiter returns, Saturn returns, or solar returns. Everyone has experienced in one way, shape, or form their Venus and their Mercury as well. Their lunar return technically happens every single month. Mars is a little bit different. Mars stays direct for 22 months out of the year. And then whenever he goes retrograde at the end of that 22 months, his retrograde lasts anywhere between 65 and 85 days. It depends on the sign and where we're at in the focus. And then he goes direct again for 22 months. And his retrograde pattern usually jumps ahead anywhere between 1 to 2 signs from wherever he was previously retrograde. So examples of that. In 2018, we had a retrograde between Aquarius and Capricorn. By 2020, we had a Mars retrograde in Aries, and it was completely in Aries, so it jumped ahead 2 signs. In the late part of 2022, going into 2023, Mars retrograde was in Gemini. It jumped the 2 signs. And in this particular instance, we have the Mars retrograde again going between Leo and Cancer. So it jumped ahead 1 to 2 signs from the previous element. Those that have their natal Mars in retrograde tend to have Mars retrograde patterns. And I don't want to just limit it to just having the natal Mars in retrograde. Sometimes people will have a direct Mars, but that Mars in their chart isn't actually a stationing Mars. Like it's about to go retrograde. If we were to calculate a progressed chart on that individual, even though in their natal it is direct, but in their progressed, it has gone retrograde. Vice versa. Some people will have natal Mars retrogrades in their chart, but after so much progression, that retrograde Mars can go direct. Now, you do not know what a progress chart is. It's a very different conversation. You can DM me with questions. I'll be happy to go over that with you. But there are elements that come through. Mars will go back over our natal placements roughly once every 2 years. However, this particular generation of people that I'm talking about, again, the ones born in late 1977 and early 1978, they're not just having a Mars return, as in Mars going back over their natal placement. No, they're having a Mars retrograde return. So many of the people that were born in that timeline are about to have a major shift in their dynamics, in their life, in their direction, that for many people is going to have a major turnaround. And if you've been in an energy where you have been feeling stagnant and you don't know what's going on, you don't know the next direction that you're taking, you don't know what's going to happen, you don't know what's being uncovered, you don't know what you don't know, and you fall into this category, this is going to be a hyper jump. Now, the question is going to be, is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's the part that's a little difficult to tell. For those that have never heard me describe Mars this way before, I'm a firm believer that with Mars, it is either a pivotal direction, a pivotal action, pivotal moments, or it is chaotic. And I've never really seen an in-between with Mars. If you have, great. Me being a Scorpio rising, I have not. So I'm going off of the dynamics that I know when it comes to this planet. Now, we've all dealt with this. It's just nobody's put it into perspective like this before. But I have a great way as to how I like to describe this. And I look at it this way. You have a job opening, you're trying to fill a position, you start getting all of these resumes in, and you get one in particular, and it's like everything is great. It is gravy. Everything lines out. It checks all of the boxes. You start looking at this guy's stuff, you start calling all of their reference, and they're awesome. Every reference is like, this is exactly what I needed. But then once we enact something, once we get that person hired and put them into their place, our mentality is hire, a couple days of training, get them their logins, but they have all of this experience, quote, quote, experience. So they should be able to slide right into place and there shouldn't be any issues. However, all of this paperwork, it's a work of art. The people that you were calling to validate like all of their work history, that's their stoner buddies from college. And you have no idea what you get into because everything this person starts to touch becomes chaos. It's a mess. Everything's all over the place. It becomes extra work because everybody's got to go and pick up the slack. They're finding all of the mistakes, and it is a moment of pure disruptive chaos. Mars retrograde chaos. Now, pivotal. The idea of pivotal Mars. You go to a TED Talk, you go sit down with somebody, you go through an actual event, and that timeline is so profound that after you have this conversation and after you have this connection and after this vibration takes over, it almost becomes like a turning point in life. After you've had this experience, there's no going back because not only did I learn the lesson, it is ingrained inside of me. It has changed my perspective. It has changed my point of view. This is an idea of pivotal Mars. And for some people, through this Mars retrograde, you will be a pivotal person in another person's life. Now, I am a firm believer that people come into our lives for a reason or a season. Sometimes we don't always know the reason. Sometimes we know the reason because, again, we had a job ad out there. The season can be a little bit harder to dictate. But what I do say is that people that start to come into your life through that pre-shadow phase, now that Mars is going to be retrograde, these are not full-term, long-lasting people. They are for a season. And by the time we get to the next chapters, that next dynamic, that next place as to where we are going to be putting our focus, how will we focus on things, and how we will be doing new things in our journey. Some of the people that help get us to that point will no longer have a purpose beyond bridging us over. Now, one of the things I said at the beginning of October, when Mars went into shadow, for those that don't remember, there were 3 rules. Some of the things from the beginning of the year would not stick. Some of the things that we did start at the beginning of the year that did stick, they're going to get tested. And this is going to still be a part of the testing. And I'm not ignoring that. But the rule number 3 that I said at the beginning of October, and the one that I have still not been able to live down, and I don't know that I'm going to live it down until we get to April, is this is not a good energy for new relationships. And I was very specific about that relationship aspect because the volatility that that relationship can come in on can remain as an imprint that stays throughout the relationship. And if you want to be able to go home and your significant other be a person of peace for you, nah, fam, don't do that. I already did it for you. Trust me. I lived through that experience. I've already told the stories, and I have been very clear about that. However, what I did say that I liked about if the idea of somebody new coming in was more on the business standpoint, someone that could help you go into new industries, to help you build into something different, something new. I did like it. But I'm still being very, very transparent and clear as I can be. A lot of these people are not going to be there for life. They are there to help you in the moment, teach you a lesson, bridge you to where you're going next, because as a collective, all of us, me, you, the dog, everybody, we're going into something new through 2025 and 2026. The things that previously used to matter, that have been on shaky ground, that have not been able to maintain their tenacity the way that we have desired, for many of us, certain dynamics are going to crumble through this Mars retrograde. Not sugarcoating that either. Anything that falls away is meant to fall away. And for a lot of people, it's going to be very, very disruptive. But it is also helping clear our plate, clear the dynamics, clear our focus, so we can go into that new dynamic, that new possibility, that new industry, the new that starts to take shape 2025 and 2026, specifically spring of 2025. April. Y'all have heard me say this before. April looks amazing. March is going to be crazy, but March is like sliding a whole bunch of things into place for what will really start to be a part of the new normal in April. Because we are going to have a new normal. It's not going to be what it has been. There's going to be a lot of shifts to get us to where we're going next. Now, I'm not going to do the dates, like I said before. What I want to go over first is I want to go over the themes that I'm picking up on in regards to Mars in Leo and its retrograde, which again, this only lasts for a month. And for other people, you're going to be more focused on the January, February timeframe, because I want to go over the themes of what I'm anticipating once we go into Mars retrograde in Cancer. So here's some of the stuff that I wrote down. Mars in Leo, things I've already been saying on the podcast a little bit too, but I'm putting a lot more emphasis on the dynamics now as to what was coming through in my meditation this morning. Shifts in power, disruptions in power, very big major change in people's plans with Mars turning retrograde 6 degrees in. It's again, a lot of us at the beginning of November, we started to unroll certain things. We started to launch certain things. We started to take some things to the next level. And for some of us, depending on the transit we were doing the new things on, if it was more mercurial, those things are going to work. They just take restructuring, revising because it's Mercury. But if they've been coming through on the Mars transits, they are not going to work. And there's going to be something that shifts us backwards and takes us back to the drawing board and shifts us into a different direction. And for some people, this dynamic is still going to have splits by the time we get to the first of the new year, of some people going in one direction and other people going in a different direction. It's just going to happen. Oh, the change in plans, the turnaround in powerful situations, kind of like what I just described, the revealing of abuses of power, and more specifically, abusive men. Sorry, dudes, it's not about you. I have no hatred. I love my fellas. It's not about that. It's more along the lines of Mars being such a masculine energy, being the god of war. Mars's dynamic tends to fall more into the masculine male category. We are going to see revealing things once Mars is completely retrograde, whenever it comes to, again, abusive power dynamics. There will be attacks or abuse against men, or the revealing of abusive men. That's going to be a big part of this dynamic. By having certain things revealed, I'm still going through the meditative stuff. I'm just looking at my notes as I'm doing this. By having certain abuses and power revealed, by having certain frustrations come to light, by having the exposure of Mars, it is going to result in transfers of power. Maybe not immediate. I'm going to be very clear about that. Maybe not immediately. But there will be some people that can no longer push forward, and they are going to be forced to take a step back, forced to, again, go back to the drawing board, forced in some ways to go into hiding. That's a different dynamic. And that's really going to come down to different signs. And I have reasons why I'm saying that, but just hear me out as I continue. Now, I do not feel everything around this is going to be negative, but I have to play the devil's advocate and talk about that negative. It is Mars. It is God of War. Really, when it comes to my little mix of like pivotal or chaotic Mars, I feel like during the retrograde, pivotal Mars is about 25% and chaotic Mars is going to be like 75%. So I'm expecting some levels of both, but it really kind of comes down to, again, people's individual karma and what they're working on or working through and what led them to this individual point, just to be clear. Okay. The more positive side, though, so going off of the idea of pivotal Mars, is powerful transformation within the masculine, specifically the triggers of men that are been trying to tap into their divine masculine. Now, I know that sounds hairy. And some people are going to be like, what did you just say? No, hear me out. When it comes to masculine energy, Leo is a masculine sign. It is the sign of the sun. It is the sign of the ego. It is the sign of power. Not everything is going to be chaotic. There will be pivotal turns. And for some people, the turnaround and the energy around the retrograde is going to allow for other people to see something differently within the idea of, again, the ego, within the idea of the masculine, trigger the transformation, but not be all of the transformation. Now, one of the things that I tend to cover whenever we talk about Mercury retrogrades is that some people will not get the full solution until after the post-shadow phase. If people are in the pivotal moments of trigger transformation at the start of this Mars retrograde, that trigger transformation will have a cocooning process, and that will be Mars retrograde going back into Cancer. A emotional turn that will then be brought to light in the springtime. Yes, I'm saying springtime again, when Mars comes back into Leo. Now, for some people, that can be business related. We've been trying to get something uncovered. We've been trying to get something launched. We've been trying to go to the next level. And then we hit some level of a brick wall. Mars turns retrograde. And we again have to go back to the drawing board, revise, revamp, redo some things, just so that way we can come back at a later date and actually have the successful launch that we desire. That's one way. Another thing that can happen is if somebody is going to an event, again, going to a TED Talk, going to sacred ceremony, going to a drumming circle, going to sweat lodges, for those that don't know that I'm Native. I know I don't look it, but I am Native. So going to sweat, going to these different areas and having that moment of clarity, having that turning event that shows them that they have to go backwards, that they have to recant and revise and restructure. And it turns into the trigger of soulful transformation. Because there is positive aspects when it comes to the word ego. A lot of people only look at ego in the sense of negative, but it's not the truth. There is a shift in regards to our confidence that is necessary. And we have to have these turning point moments that allows for the change to progress as it's going to. So we can have a very big turning point transformation in a multitude of different ways. And again, there can be pivotal Mars moments just as much as chaotic. I do feel like there will be more chaotic for a lot of people, but I also feel like that we are meant to see gains because remember, Mars turning retrograde, he's hosting the North Node. And that is the head of the dragon. I will have, I will consume, I will desire, very much greedy baby energy. But whenever it comes to the other aspects of the North Node, it feels faded. It feels anointed. It feels like we're gaining something that we are meant to gain at this time. And that aspect of gains is why I do not want to completely dismiss and say Mars retrograde, pure chaos immense. It's not the case. There will be elements of both. There will be positives and negatives. There will be gains just as much as disruption. There will be elements of both. And I want people to be prepared for that. The obstacle course is a test. We are in an obstacle course energy. We have been for a while. We will continue to be. This is one element of our obstacle course. Our next one is going to start in January whenever we go into Mars in Cancer, and then everything else going the other direction. So we're on one phase of the obstacle course, but for some people, if you were on the monkey bars, this is when it's getting harder. So when I was using that example before, of we're at the start of an obstacle course in the beginning of November. Some of us are going on to the monkey bars. And whenever we're starting to go across, we're going to start getting hit by paintballs. You're still on the same obstacle course. You are still trying to achieve the same things. You are going to have hits of disruption, but it's not always your disruption. It's not always a negative against you. A lot of people, whenever they start to experience the waves and these quakes of disruption, it's going to be outside sources. It's going to be those people being grabbed by energy. And it's like you get hit by the debris. And I want you to be prepared for that. Oh, some people will fail the test. They will get to the end of this Mars retrograde and they will hate everything in the world. They will. For others, they will thrive in it, again, because of our own personal levels of alignment and how we are handling this energy. And others are going to just make it through by the skin of their teeth. It's just going to be like, I don't know how I'm surviving this. I don't know how I'm waking up in the morning. I don't even know how I'm getting to work tomorrow. I don't even know where the money's coming from. It's just happening. And it's like head down, mouth shut scenarios for some people that I just don't want to get hit with the debris. I don't want to deal with your chaos. I don't want to get hit with any of this. I just want to stay here with my feet firmly planted or with my hands firmly attached to each bar that I'm taking on. I'm not going to acknowledge that my ribs just got hit with a paintball or debris or whatever else that it is. Now, again, Mars retrograde in Leo, very short-lived. It will be done in a month. And by the time we get to January, the dynamic, the tone, the pain, it will change. And I am not sugarcoating this by any means. It's going to be heavier. In September, when Mars went into Cancer, yes, it was combined with Pluto going into Capricorn, but Pluto's not in Capricorn anymore. And one of the things I said about before, if you are not doing well with Mars in Cancer, if you cannot get a hold of your emotions with Mars in Cancer, you are going to have a very rude awakening during the Mars retrograde. January 6th, Mars will retrograde back into Cancer. Now, there's a lot of transits that take us to that point. There's going to be a lot of things that are going on right around January 6th. I don't want to get too hyper-focused on all the dates. Like I said before, I want to stay focused on the themes of what I see coming. And then there will be a couple of things I'll cover at the end. But this is more of a meditative rant video than anything else. So I'm going to just keep reminding everybody of that. When Mars goes back into Cancer, we have to look at the themes of Cancer. Cancer, one, it is associated with the moon. It's associated with mothers. There is an emotional element to Cancer, but there is also a rooted, please note how I'm saying this, rooted element to Cancer. Now, why do I say that? The zodiac starts at Aries. The fourth house from Aries is Cancer. Home, home life, family, roots, ancestry. When Mars goes retrograde into Cancer, there will be some people that feel very determined to know who and where they come from. And I've seen an influx of this recently, of people doing their DNA tests or doing their genealogy or having to do these types of things because there's something in regards to medical history that up until this point, because I've also talked about the medical astrology a lot in the recent episodes, and you guys know that I have. Up until this point, there hadn't been a need to focus on the medical. But then things have happened over the course of the last 3, 6, 9 months. And for a lot of you, since July, a couple more of you since spring of last year, that it's now going to take us to take pivotal, see how I'm starting with this one, pivotal, necessary, disruptive action. We got to uncover some things. So I'm using the word disruption to be able to understand the roots better. And again, that DNA aspect, the genetics aspect of trying to understand where we come from. Now, again, that's going off of the idea of positive Mars and Cancer. However, not everybody is in the need to go back and find their genetic DNA and yada, yada, yada. No, there's going to be other things. Mars and Cancer, the undoing, the uncovering, the dismantling, and or the demise of where we feel rooted, of our family dynamics. What we once cared for will not be the same. How we once cared for certain people will not remain the same. And the whole idea will be to start to, again, disrupt the previous structure, the previous story, so that the truth can be revealed. I know that sounds super odd to a lot of people, but whenever it comes to individuals and how they came into this world, how their family dynamics work out, no two families are exactly the same. The idea of the picturesque family from, TV shows and cartoons and all, for a lot of people, that has been a very unrealistic thing. And there will be the uncovering of family secrets. Hi, I have once been the family secret. So trust and believe when I say the things about family secrets. That's a big possibility. What we once cared for will not be the same. And whenever it comes to the pain around mothers and our childhood, that is also needing to be disrupted because, again, the previous story is not how the story is going to remain. Additional truths need to come to light. Now, I want to keep that going. For some people, it's not going to be about the past situation. It will be more about present situations. And that's going to be a harder pill to swallow. We can have the revealing of harm, damage, pain around mothers, so the abuse of mothers, but potentially even worse, the abuse from mothers, from them. Violence, fighting, tensions, disruption, volatility, reactions, and actions surrounding children and their caretakers. So it's not always going to be moms. Let's be real about that. Some people get raised by their grandparents, get raised by their aunties or whatever. their uncles, whoever it is. And I'm not placing blame on anybody. It's more along the lines of, I'm just saying the word caretaker now. There can be disruption in regards to children and their caretakers. Who has been their caretaker might not remain the same. Who previously was their caretaker might have to relinquish rights back to parents in some level of dynamic. Now, I'm not going off of houses when I talk this. I'm going off of the themes of Cancer. Other themes around Cancer that I'm going to put some focus on too: the converting of existing structures, lands, and buildings for new actionable gains. And I have a very specific wording when I said that: actionable gains. Converting an old hotel into a condo unit. So it's an existing structure. We've already had it, but it was previously rated, commercial use, or however that gets rated. And I'm suddenly going blank on commercial usage. We can talk land and home construction all day, but commercial, I don't remember the R ratings and all that. So hear me out. Commercial usage and having it revised to be able to go to a different type of housing. So multi-unit housing, but that means going through and redoing all of these individual hotel room floors to an actual like condominium unit, or turning an old commercial building, because we've had so many commercial building vacancies, and turning them into housing. So conversion of an old structure, old building, old situations into a new actionable gain. And we've seen examples of that. You can actually Google, like there's places out there that they have converted, old malls into different types of commercial units. There have also been usages of turning malls into actual like condos, or turning again old hotels into that. Old office buildings are starting to become a big part of that conversation too, because we have to revise and revamp the way that we've looked at housing. So that's going to be a big thing. Whenever it comes to Cancer, there's going to be revamping and revising as to like how we look at homes and the necessity and the need for them. The other term that I have on here is that converting of structures also for military gain. Because again, Mars is the god of war. And it's not all action and desire. We can have the things that are tied to military gain. And there can also be the need for like things like eminent domain, where like land or property is taken forcibly because it's going to have another action. So eminent domain would be like taking old farmland and forcing the sale to the government, because we're going to convert it to a highway. Not something that we've had to deal with real big in the forefront of these last few years, but that doesn't mean anything. But when I'm looking at the idea of the North Node being in Aries and what Mars is doing, I do feel like there can be actionable gains. And that's not specific just to Mars and Cancer. That can still talk about Mars and Leo stuff. And the way that action can come through can still be something that is disruptive. And it can still be something that is an abuse of power. And it is a forced action, again, for the idea of gains. Okay. Land disasters, especially once Mars goes back into Cancer. So what I'm talking about now is major storms and stuff like that. We are in winter. Let's say going into, we're in winter. So we can have certain things that like force us to sit still, because like massive storms outside, this is just a normal thing going into this time of year anyways. But I saw in that 1977, 1978, one of the top headlines that was coming through during that time was like major blizzards that like shut down some of the cities. And that's not something that we have every single year. But since that was something that was very big during that particular Mars retrograde, again, between Leo and Cancer, that's the other reason I'm bringing that one up. We've had other winters before that had nothing to do with the Mars retrograde, that they were also bad. But since that was one of the major headlines that I kept seeing, I wanted to bring that part up again. The desecration of sacred monuments, places, and graves. So, one of the interesting headlines that I saw in the 1978 Mars retrograde is right at the end of that Mars retrograde, Charlie Chaplin was one of many graves that had had their gravesite robbed. And there was like an influx of grave robbery of some sort in the 1978 Mars retrograde. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that every single grave is going to have, that's not what I'm saying. You guys know that I don't do that. But it is more along the lines of, it was a pattern that I thought was interesting to bring up because it can be something that comes up again in the headlines. If there is that level of desecration, like what I was saying before, whether it is like sacred monuments, and sacred was a word that I was hearing when I was writing these parts of the notes out. It was a very specific song that I hear that I know that has the word sacred. And when I was writing this part of my notes, it kept coming up. So like sacred monuments, sacred places. And I just wrote graves. When I consider a gravesite for a lot of people, that memorial aspect, it's supposed to be sacred, but you guys get where I'm going with that. Okay. Again, the dismantling of family dynamics to allow for a restructuring later. And I do feel like the restructuring again is going to be after Mars goes direct, but even more so next year when Jupiter comes into Cancer. So right now where Jupiter's at, and I know I haven't had a reason to talk about Jupiter, but the last time we had a Mars retrograde, Mars was in Gemini. And a lot of where Jupiter has been doing its healing and growth and change and expansion has been in an area of the sky where the previous Mars retrograde was. Whenever we get through this Mars retrograde and Mars finally goes into Leo, one of the things that will happen next summer, specifically on June 9th, is we will start a year of Jupiter in Cancer. And I think the expansion, the growth, and the healing effect of Jupiter going into Cancer will be very, very helpful to do any levels of recovery for the frustrating situations that happen during the Mars retrograde in these areas of the sky. Now, Jupiter going over those areas in particular will actually take all the way up until 2026. But that doesn't dismiss what I'm saying. We need things to be tore down, broke down, taken apart, disrupted before new things can come in. And that again goes into, I don't know that anything that gets disrupted in the Mars retrograde will have an immediate turnaround and benefit until we get into springtime transits and the summer transits. Now I'm specifically talking about when Jupiter goes into Cancer. And there's going to be a lot of other transits that happen in the meantime. I'm going off of some of the themes. Now, some of the other things that I saw in the 1970, 1977, 78, time frame, whenever that Mars retrograde was happening, we had a serial killer on the loose. His name was Ted Bundy. He had broke out of prison in that Mars retrograde. So Ted Bundy was actually a Leo rising, for those that don't know. And I thought was interesting is like Mars went retrograde in Leo. He got loose somehow. Don't know how, don't really care how. I'm not getting into that part. And throughout the entirety of the Mars retrograde, that was him running amok until he got caught close to the end of that Mars retrograde. And he was caught in like Pensacola, Florida. But that Mars retrograde, he was on the run. So one of the things I have said to some of the Leo risings that is like when Mars goes retrograde back into your 12th house, is there could be like forced forms of isolation or forced forms of escape or feeling isolated, feeling like you've been ousted out, you've been pushed out, you've been eliminated in some way, like something happens. And I thought that was a really interesting example of Mars retrograde in the 12th, because he chose to go on the run. He chose to escape and show his ass some more, because we're talking about Ted Bundy here. And he went on the run. And of course, he got caught. It was all a temporary energy. He was brought back into the prison system, brought back into the justice system, forced to go through all of his trial. Like, there was forced elements to that. But I thought that was rather interesting. There's a couple of things that happened during that timeline. But one of the other historical energies that I got very stuck on was the OK Corral, the shootout at the OK Corral. Now, this is not 1978, obviously. Obviously, this is actually a lot further back than that. This is between the end of 1881 and the beginning of 1882. And for those that like to look at documentaries, but then you actually like to know the historical references and stuff behind it, this is one of those things. So there is a series, there was a little Netflix docu-series type thing that was put on Netflix, I don't know, summertime. I think it was like June, July, something like that. And I watched it with my mom. But you know me, I watch things with an astrology brain. Like, I don't look like everybody has their little niche of like what little rabbit holes they go through afterwards. I thought it was really interesting. And the whole dynamic of whenever that was all happening, it was like, was this a Mars retrograde? My mom's like, don't do that. It's like, but I think it was. Like, I really started to feel like it was. So I ended up going backwards and doing the history lesson. And sure enough, the timeline of the OK Corral, and I mean the whole timeline. I am not just talking about the shootout at the OK Corral. I am talking about pre-shadow, the Mars retrograde that happened. And that Mars retrograde, guys, it was in Cancer. Oh, look at that. It was actually between Cancer and Gemini, but it was primarily in Cancer. And I thought that was very interesting, considering most of our upcoming Mars retrograde is going to be in Cancer. Okay. And then the post phase. And if you guys have not watched this documentary yet, I actually want you to do it, but I want you to watch it with an astrology brain for just a second. It's about 8 episodes. And you can tell by the end of the episodes, they're starting to goof up on their dates a little bit. Like, they're not as accurate with their dates as they are in the very beginning, because they're doing their best based off of like all of the old newspapers that they can potentially find. Because again, this was happening in the 1880s. But I thought it was interesting that this entire timeline, one, that it was so big that everybody in the nation was like in on the drama. Like, everybody was watching it. Every news outlet was reporting on it. The Morse code industry, that's all they're talking about. Let's get OK Corral, OK Corral, OK Corral. But the timeline of it is like super, super interesting. So if you go watch this, the Mars retrograde during that timeline actually didn't start until like November of 1881. The actual shootout occurred when Mars was direct, but Mercury was stationing. That Mercury was a Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius. Hey, look, our current Mercury retrograde is in Sagittarius. The shootout happened while Mars was in a slowdown stationing point. All the misinformation that started to blow through happened during a Mercury retrograde. The timeline of when the Wyatts, yeah, because there was more than one brother that got arrested. But whenever the Wyatts and Doc Holliday were actually in jail, it was during a Mars retrograde. And it was right after Mercury was direct and finally moving out of Sagittarius, and right after Mars went retrograde, that Wyatts and Doc Holliday were given their innocent. What's the verdict? That's the word. But then what started to happen throughout the Mars retrograde was the way that the guy that caused all the trouble, his name was what was that again? Thomas Fitch. In that particular docudrama, and like I said, you can go watch this yourself, but I want you to watch it from an astrological point of view. During the entire Mercury retrograde, Thomas Fitch was like, he had to have mutable placements. I think this guy was a Gemini rising or a Sagittarius rising. There is no birth info on this man because it was a long time ago. And it was very uncommon for people that were not of high born status, air quotations on that, to record their birth time. So it's very unlikely we're ever going to see a birth time. But I think he was either a Gemini rising or a Sag rising, just because of how the transits were going through. After Mars turned retrograde and he started to go attack the Wyatt family, it was during the Mars retrograde, and he was doing it in a very sneaky way. He wasn't direct about it anymore after he lost the suit against Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and all them. So him and his band of boys start doing outlaw things. And what I also thought was very interesting is because of the way they behaved, it also enacted something else within Wyatt Earp. Now, Wyatt Earp was known up until a certain point to be like a very steadfast individual. We follow the law. We're not going to go in this other direction. We're not going to do outlaw ways. We are trying to be above board. But during that particular Mars retrograde, he didn't have the ability to stay. And one of the interesting things that came through from that timeline is that the lawman became the outlaw. And that was also a big theme for him in that particular time frame during that Mars retrograde. Is the lawman, the man that always took a certain care in his actions, the one that always went in a very specific direction. I'm going to walk this line. I stay steadfast. He threw that all to the wind because of the disruption, Mars retrograde, to his family, Mars retrograde in Cancer. The disruption to his family. And throughout the remainder of the Mars retrograde, you're following a story about the lawman that became the outlaw, the lawman that was even being hunted by law officials, the lawman that is being funded by very big names that we actually know even now. And this timeline even became something that impacted JP Morgan's ability to buy the railroads, because it covers part of this, part of this in this docudrama. And that is during that time, JP Morgan was trying to get the money to buy the railroads. And suddenly he actually couldn't get the money from like the Lloyds of London and the banks in London that he was trying to get the money from, because, well, the dollar is going to be backed by silver. Well, you can't get the silver safely across when you have all these outlaw issues. The OK Corral shootout and all the drama around this literally impacted JP Morgan in London. Now, what they don't cover, and this is now the history part that I thought was interesting, is this right here completely derailed JP Morgan's ability to buy the railroads for like another 10 years. He wasn't able to do it until after the railroads crashed, and that ended up happening around 1893. So this one event and timeline had a rippling historic value to the extent that it literally, we still talk about it today. We are still fascinated about it today. And if you watch the thing from start to finish, what I thought was the most interesting is that Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday did not finally completely release their ties to Tombstone and go in different directions until after the Mars retrograde and Mars left shadow. So around the time that Mars ended its retrograde, that's when people were starting to come up going, hey, it's time to like, we're over this. It's not as fun anymore. We don't want to fund it anymore. We don't want to be a part of this anymore. And there was a lot of people starting to hold the brakes on the, lawman turned outlaw temporarily. So there became like little issues. But ultimately, whenever I did the calculations for back then, Mars left shadow in April of 1882 and was finally in May of 1882 that Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp actually finally left Tombstone. So if you want something that kind of gives you a perspective, watch this documentary from an astrological standpoint, knowing that one phase of it has a Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius. It is Mars going into shadow. Mars retrograde actually does not start until Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday are in jail. The turnaround that happened in the abuses of power were whenever the lawman in the scenario, I don't even remember his name right now, has things turn against him, and it has this ripple and wave effect that follows. And the whole timeline of like the lawman turning into the outlaw was a Mars retrograde that was primarily in Cancer, but it was also partly in Gemini. And by the time all of that was said and done, and they finally leave Tombstone, that's whenever Mars left its shadow. And I thought that was a very interesting timeline to like research and do the comparisons, especially whenever I saw that the Mars retrograde and that Mercury retrograde was in similar placements as to where they are with this one, not direct, but similar. So that way people can actually go see just like the full unwinding of how that temporary action and reaction, that temporary dismantling, that temporary action can have a long-term rippled effect in regards to how things were structured and redone afterwards. And again, that was an historic moment that impacted all across the nation, impacted individuals into other countries, all throughout a Mars retrograde. The grab of attention that occurred had a ripple effect. It was kind of crazy to watch from an astrological standpoint to see how that all laid out. It's like, oh wow, that's some hellacious timing for all of that. Okay. Again, if you know somebody that was born in that late 1977, early 1978, this is going to be a very big year for them in regards to whatever their Mars pattern is. If you have anyone in your life that has a natal Mars in retrograde, or their natal Mars is like indirect from their sun placement, so it's very likely that they have either a stationing Mars that's about to go retrograde in their chart, or their Mars is just past the retrograde. But these people can still have patterns of Mars retrogrades. And if you have a natal Mars retrograde in your chart, their pattern actually has to do with like every 2 years, we have a massive amount of change. We have massive disruption. We have massive turnarounds. We can all have Mars retrograde patterns, but it tends to be far more noticeable for those people that have it as a natal placement. So there's that. If you're Mars ruled, you can also have this 2-year pattern. That means if you are a Scorpio rising like myself or an Aries rising, you can also have this information. You can have these situations. So a lot of this can apply to you. But again, this is kind of a meditative rant video. I didn't really do anything on the charts. I didn't want to do 6 months worth of dates backwards and forwards. I've been very clear about everything as best as I can be with each weekly episode to expect different levels of disruption and turns and chaos. And I'm saying that here now again. This again was more just something to now I'm losing my ability to talk, to go over like different points of reference and different timelines and different themes, so that way people kind of know what things to look for and to expect. And some of you guys have already been tuned into this. you've been seeing like different things in the headlines and you send me the links or you message me going, hey, did you see this yet? Have you found this yet? Or if it's in your local news, you'll send me your local news stuff. I love it when you guys do that because it's really funny to me whenever people do send it to me. They're like, what transit is this? Is this Mars? Is this Pluto? What is this one? I don't know what's going on. Is this a Venus thing? Like, when you have those things going on, you can message me those headlines. I actually prefer it in a lot of ways just because if I'm doing this stuff, I'm not seeing anything that's going on in the social media aspect or in news media. So when certain things go on and you got a question as to like which transit that is, send me the link. Helps me out a bunch. Okay. Again, this was a meditative rant video. I haven't done one of these in a really long time, but I wanted to put a lot more emphasis on just some of the themes of what we were going to be looking at. And link in the description, I will also link the previous Mars Pluto videos and stuff that I did back at the beginning of the year that are also going to reference some of the timeline of this part of the year. So I love and appreciate every single one of you. I will talk to everybody very, very soon. Subscribe.